Trade and environmental
Being
justice.
struck the term of
the Alien and Sedition Act.
Discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
I'm going to keep my introduction of John Hope Franklin very brief today. No one wants to hear me tell about this amazing, legendary, brilliant human being when they can have the opportunity to hear him himself. Dr. Franklin was born in Wrightsville, Oklahoma in 1915, only 50 years after slavery had been abolished. His entire life has been dedicated to the abolition of ignorance, and particularly ignorance in one of its most virulent forms, racism. The highlights of his career are mileposts of the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm going to list only a few of them. 1934, John Hope Franklin handed President Roosevelt a petition calling for a response to the Cordy Cheek lynching. 1954, he aided Thurgood Marshall's preparation of the brief in Brown versus the Board of Education. 1965, he marched in Montgomery, Alabama. 1987, he testified against Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court. 1995, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. 1997, he was appointed head of President Clinton's President's Initiative on Race. Dr. Franklin published From Slavery to Freedom, A History of African Americans in 1947. This classic and foundational text is also a bestseller, selling over 3 million copies in many different languages. His other books include, and this is a sampling, and just a sampling, The Militant South, Reconstruction After the Civil War, The Emancipation Proclamation, A Southern Odyssey, Racial Equality in America, George Washington Williams, and The Color Line, Legacy for the 21st Century. Dr. Franklin has been the recipient of over 130 honorary degrees and has won of just about every conceivable academic and civic pride, including most recently the 2006 Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Award for his quite amazing autobiography, and it's on sale outside, MirrorToAmerica. Those of us who are fortunate to work in this building, in the John Hope Franklin Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies, pass his photograph every day and have the opportunity to contemplate a life well lived, a life of courage and gentleness, warmth and vigor, intellect and passion, history and futurity, diligence and spontaneity, and all undergirded by serious and deep principle. A life of greatness, in my definition. I think all of us who come to the Franklin Center like to believe that by doing the best work we can, according to his principles, we imbibe just a little of his spirit and honor his legacy. It is a gift for all of us to know John Hope Franklin, and an honor to be able to contribute in a very small and modest ways to the vision he exemplifies. Mostly, it is an honor for me personally to be able to introduce today the man who inspires us all.
About the Franklin Center, which I regard as the eatingest place in Durham. I'm delighted and honored to be here, and particularly to be introduced by Kathy, who was so instrumental in launching this whole enterprise called the Franklin Center. She was the director of it at the outset, and could helped to conceive it, and brought it to where it is today. And for her and for Carla Holloway and the others who were so instrumental in creating the center and in projecting the activities that characterize it, that's something that I will always cherish and appreciate. I'm going to talk very briefly today about what I call some reflections on the present crisis, with the hope that it will stimulate some reaction and discussion, which will conclude the hour. Some years ago, I was having lunch in a rather tawny restaurant in Istanbul, Turkey. I was a bit startled to hear a sharp, reprimanding, and loud, unmistakably American male voice he shouted at an innocent-looking Turkish waiter, "How dare you bring me a can of warm Coke and a glass of shaved ice when I told you I drink my Cokes out of a can?" The waiter respectfully apologized and sought quickly to make demands for his mistake. Even then, I wondered what the waiter and the other patrons thought of this boisterous, bullying American who was imposing his will and his power over a hapless subordinate. On another occasion, when I was traveling in South Asia as chair of the Fulbright Board, I visited Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. I had known of one of the junior cultural officers there since she was a graduate in one of our prized Southern institutions, not Duke University. She had come a long way since emerging from a West Virginia high school and had graduated from college. And when I encountered her in Colombo, Ceylon, I congratulated her for having made such great strides. She thanked me profusely, and then she apologized to me for not having been able to arrange a dinner with a dozen guests. She said she'd wished that she could have entertained me more lavishly, but she was down to her last 2 servants. And she would not be able to pull off the kind of social responsibility that she felt. And when I observed at a luncheon that she did arrange and extend to me, I wondered why or how she had any servants left. One final example of personal experience will suffice. On one occasion, my wife and I were traveling in the Soviet Union where I was lecturing. And in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, a person in the audience asked me how rich I was. I said that I was not at all rich. Then she asked me how had I obtained my education and my advanced degrees if I was not wealthy. For in the United States, he understood that only the very wealthy Americans could obtain an education. And that gave me an opportunity to explain to him the system of scholarships and other benefits, aside from public education, that were available in the United States. It was clear to me that the distorted impression abroad was that in our class-ridden society, wealth and privilege were all important in moving from one level of society to another. While it was in the interest of the Soviets to promulgate such false doctrines, we unfortunately contribute to them by the way we act and the manner in which we were willing to pull rank at the slightest opportunity. These incidents add up to a very distorted picture of the American abroad, ugly or not. And I've often wondered how many Turks, or indeed how many people anywhere, harbored some hostility or animosity toward us on the basis of the boorish crudity or the all too conspicuously rich Americans traveling abroad. As some of the British described American soldiers during World War II, overpaid, oversexed, and overheard. Perhaps these views of Americans are distorted, exaggerated, even inaccurate. Nevertheless, they contribute to the overall views of Americans that so many in other countries hold and that inform and shape their positions and policies where Americans are concerned. These attitudes are reinforced by official policies that we pursue. When I was a delegate to the Belgrade UNESCO conference in 1980, I was proud to see ourselves as a normal participant in a world policy-making body nurturing and fostering cultural, educational, and scientific practices and policies for the benefit of mankind in general. 4 years later, the United States had withdrawn from UNESCO and remained out for a number of years. We had no connection with the one international body that had been created for the specific purpose of promoting the common good based on man's intelligence and commitment to improving his well-being at every level. We recently indicated our intention of rejoining UNESCO, and we did. And I hope that we have and been able to become full participants once again in that international organization. I was talking with a friend and former colleague of mine who had been one of the executives in UNESCO, and I talked to him just a few days ago when I was contemplating what I'm saying here, and he pointed out that although we had rejoined UNESCO, that it remained essentially an impotent organization compared to other international bodies and compared to the kind of unilateral position which we almost invariably take when it comes to international problems of any kind, and that we were essentially ineffective in that body as we are ineffective in most of our international connections. But until we use international bodies like UNESCO and the United Nations, we will not be able to effectively and constructively criticize and assist countries whose health, educational, and cultural policies and problems appear to us to be out of line with what we think they should be. This leads me to wonder about our imperiousness and our aloofness that are the most effective ways we feel to move our own agenda forward, if indeed our agenda is worth moving forward. Meanwhile, we steadily decline to participate jointly and constructively in the solution of problems that are critical to the future of the world in which we hope to live. Just think of the critical areas in which we take no position or are opposed to any action or ignore altogether. For years, the United States has steadfastly refused to ratify the treaty that would control and ultimately eliminate the use of landmines that result in the killing and maiming of thousands of innocent human beings each year. Moreover, we simply ignore the signs that indicate that the entire globe is gradually warming. If we do nothing to control the emission of deadly gases for which we are more responsible than any other country on the planet, we shall be engulfed in such catastrophic destruction of the planet to the point that it will no longer be habitable. Indeed, we shy away from most movements and most proposals that provide some semblance of environmental protection or control over pollution of the places we inhabit, in the mistaken belief that our resources are beyond and without limit. Consequently, we need not fear their exhaustion within the lifetime of the planet. Although the United States adheres to the general principle of having united international courts of justice, we as a nation have refused to agree to a court that will try citizen soldiers of the United States for violation of the laws of war in which they participate and stand accused of criminal acts. In other words, it is quite all right to try military personnel from other countries for violating the law, but citizens of the United States must remain above the law and must remain immune from prosecution for allegedly violating the law. It is indeed difficult to see how the United States can function in an international environment if this nation exempts itself from laws that it expects other nations to obey. Then there is the matter of the participation of the United States in the United Nations as a full-fledged dues-paying member. When the United Nations came into existence in 1945, many of us hoped that it would be the peacekeeping body of all times, and its prospects of playing such a role were bright indeed in its beginning years. We remembered our isolationist role in the old League of Nations after World War I, and we were determined in 1945, 6, and 7, that we would not be guilty of doing that again, of being the isolationist, obstructionist nation that we were in the 1920s. There would be difficulties, of course, since member nations represented every conceivable view and philosophy on this political spectrum. But when the senior United States Senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms, became chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the United Nations was immediately targeted as an object of disdain. It was criticized for its policies and activities, and the United States began to withhold its dues. And within a few years, the United States was many millions of dollars in arrears in our dues at a time when we were becoming much more critical and much more demanding of the United Nations. Finally, after several years of isolationist obstruction, Senator Helms relented somewhat, and the United States began to make some payments on its delinquent account. Even so, for years we remained in arrears to the extent that more than $800 million, which we finally and somewhat reluctantly paid. There's something incongruous about the richest nation in the world ordering an international body, such as the United Nations, to take action, such as inspecting the status of weaponry in Iraq, when that action would involve payments by such poor countries as Chile, Timor, Romania, and Iceland, but not by the United States. There's something quite undemocratic about advocating regime change. I'm quite aware of the undeniable fact that in the past, the United States has participated in regime change in many parts of the world, including that part of Mexico which we took in 1847. But such actions certainly do not bring any credit to this country or its traditions. Only in the present crisis have we openly declared as our objective a regime change, for example, in Iraq, in a process that is obviously undemocratic and even revolutionary. I have an eerie feeling, even in discussing a regime change, as if it were a mere routine operation of throwing out one leader for a so-called better one to be selected by powers that change the regime. This is a ghastly renunciation of the very principles that we claim to espouse. Countries that pride themselves in being able and willing and anxious to participate in revolutionary activities in other parts of the world should take the utmost caution in taking steps to involve this country in such procedures. One must also be aware of the fact that as we strive toward democracy, we must take the utmost caution of even thinking about changing the government of a country in another part of the world with a history and culture profoundly different from its own. I had hoped that the present crisis could be resolved without an all-out war, but that was not to be, since we insisted that Iraq had arsenals of weapons of mass destruction. But we, of all countries of the world, know what it means to unleash weapons of mass destruction. As the only nation in the world that has used weapons of mass destruction, nuclear bombs, not once but twice, not on a lonely Pacific island to demonstrate what the use of them is like, but on two of the most densely populated cities on the face of the earth. We also know that it should not, must not happen again. I hope and trust that we will be able to proceed with our tasks without interruption. We deserve that. We deserve the opportunity to pursue our goals in a peaceful manner and not in pursuit of some goals that we have no need or cause to pursue. I hope that this nation, having already experienced numerous holocausts in the past century, can get through this next century in the peace that surpasses all understanding, and that it can show the world that while there may be something great about winning a war, there is something even greater about learning to use the tools of peacemaking and peacekeeping. And that should be for the building of a better world, a world in which we can all live as one human family. And as we look toward the future, we can despair, but we can work to be certain that the talents we have and the resources we have are for the purpose of promoting peace and understanding, and that we can, as the most powerful nation in the world, renounce war as uncivilized and brutal. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. It's our second of the series of the new session of Humanities at the Center. And we love to invite some of our commentators now. I'm going to just put a list of them, and we'll start with comments. My name is Miguel Rojas Sotelo. I work for the Duke Center for International and Global Studies and the Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and I'm moderating today's talk. As you heard from Dr. Franklin, his worldview was very sharp and direct back in 2006. We are facing many issues that are very similar to those and that they echo in time. And we'll start our comments with Professor Pedro Lasch, director of the Franklin Humanities Institute Social Practice Lab. He's a research professor of art history, and visual studies. Please, Pedro, you can start.
Thank you, Miguel, and welcome everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this series. I've always been a great admirer of John Hope Franklin, so I think it's a great way to begin this conversation about, global anti-racism histories and movements. I wanted to, since we all listened to his talk, and I assume that many of us are familiar with his work, I wanted to kind of start with some remarks that would historically contextualize a little bit the time in which he delivered that talk, and the ongoing struggle of racism in the US, but also globally speaking. I think it's important to remember, especially if any in the audience are kind of younger, like students or even graduate students, that in 2006 and 2007, there were multiple really challenging things going on. On the one hand, he makes direct reference to the invasion of Iraq, right? And the false claim of them having weapons of mass destruction, which served as the excuse for the invasion and the still to this date ongoing disaster there. So there's the invasion of Iraq, but then there's also, and we can kind of connect that to the global history of racism, right? And as it connects to the Middle East. In that case, it's not an anti-Black racism, it's anti-Semitism, as including both, of course, Jews and Muslims, because the notion of the Semite includes that category. I think the second important context that I'd like to bring in is Katrina. I think Katrina made very clear to most Americans that the legacy of racism and unequal treatment by their own government or our own government was very alive. So even those who were in denial all of a sudden woke up. I remember living through those days, how even mainstream journalists, of course now we live through that a lot more with the current president, but at the time it was quite rare to hear journalists lose their cool and their supposed objectivity and really kind of ask questions that noted an affect, because people were so upset at the level of irresponsibility and incompetence with which the government responded to the disaster, right? The third context, which again, I think brings in a different light of racism, is the immigrant rallies of 2006, of April and May. There had not been such massive protests since the civil rights movement. And the protests looked different, but they shared a lot. You know, they shared, of course, the struggle of, you know, African Americans and Blacks in general, but they brought in a new population that some was not new at all. It had been here since the very creation of the country, but it looked different, right? And it brought in an alliance of, you know, Afro-Latino groups, as well as Latino and Hispanic groups, but it brought in a much bigger conversation about what race meant in this country, beyond the Black and white dynamics that we had seen before. So I think it's important to keep that in the conversation also, right? From there, I kind of wanted to kind of reflect a little bit on the echoes that we hear between both the context in which you know, he gives his talk and what he directly addresses in the talk. Of course, the talk, because of the series that he was giving it for, is an internationalist talk, right? It addresses United Nations, UNESCO, and if correct me if I'm wrong, but racism, I don't think comes up at all as a term. Of course, there are kind of ways to speak of it through his address, but he does not directly speak of racism, right? However, I think it's not far-fetched to think that when he speaks of wealth and privilege and the, you know, the unilateralism, the imperiousness and aloofness, that he directly uses those words, that what we would call that, of course, now, and that word was already used then, but he doesn't use it, is white privilege, right? So this aggressive bully performance of white privilege as a staple American feature, I think is something that we can kind of definitely recognize in our days. I think I don't want to go too long because there's other respondents and I want to make sure we have time for conversation. Two last things that I wanted to bring up that resonate with me today are his staunch internationalism, right? We, of course, live in a time now where we couldn't have foreseen, I think, from between 2006 and now, how much further to the right this country had gone. You know, George W. Bush was already shocking to so many people, his us versus them type of policy and ideology. But now we're in a whole other territory, and it's a territory of populist nationalism, you know? And it's not just in the US, it's a world picture. Not everything, I think, could be blamed on the current president. I think he's just a symptom of this. And so this idea of a nationalism is deeply opposed to, I think, what you know, John Hope Franklin always kind of spoke for and advocated. So I think placing the history of anti-racism and Black identity, and just like he speaks of weaving in that quote we had at the end, you know, that African Americans into the history of this country so they cannot be taken out anymore. I think I see that as an internationalist project, not one that is just about the US, right? The African diaspora needs to be, we need to do that in the global perspective, not just in the US perspective. We need to do that in Mexico, the country where I was born. We need to do that in Latin America. You know, so the African diaspora needs to be written into the history, and we have to stop excluding it, right? The last thing I will say is how I think it's time to recognize that moderate whites are just not moderate. You know, I think the attitudes that he starts his address with are attitudes that we also recognize in the liberal white population too often. And I think in a way, it's also a symptom of that often so-called silent majority that is not silent or moderate at all. So perhaps in the conversation, we can reflect on those echoes between 2020 and the 2006 when he spoke. I think I'll end there and I'll turn my camera off, okay?
Thank you so much, Pedro. We want to share a message that was sent by Chia some minutes ago. She and Professor Ranji are in a meeting. They are trying to finish it to join us. But this is really interesting because what we're trying to do in Wednesdays at the Center this year with the series is to go back to the archive and to see how committed many of Duke faculty, staff, students have been for years, decades on these issues. She wanted to share this. I started my Franklin Humanities Institute job in 2006, and the Mirror to America talk was the first public event I helped to organize, or it had already been organized. I just had to help direct the enormous overflow crowd. This is shared by Christina, Chia. A very personal take on this, and she and Ranji will be also joining us for September 23rd event that will be rebroadcasting. That was the last event that Dr. Franklin had, the last event in which he spoke at the center, and one of the last ones he spoke at Duke before his passing. And this event was actually introduced by Srinivas, who also had departed us. Then, yes, I think that Pedro had a lot of things.
Miguel, sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure if you're looking at the chat, but I think Chris and Ranji are saying that they've arrived. So if you
want. Great. Oh, welcome. Yeah, I cannot talk and see and do all these things together that we are now prone to do at Duke. It will be great to listen from you, Chris, to remind us a little bit of what it was, that event that day. I suppose that Gianluca can help me to identify them, open their camera and their microphone, please. Anyone in the back end, or Meredith, or Amanda?
Hi.
Hello, Chris. Great to see you. Welcome back to Wednesdays at the Center.
Yes. I just suddenly had a flashback of having done a bunch of these introductions in those early years. I don't have too much to share, and I wasn't able to attend. I wasn't able to actually rewatch the video with all of you. But I just want to say how vividly I remember, I don't remember, it might've been like, within my first week at the job, right? So this was like midweek, my first week at the FHI, I think. Obviously I'd been a student at Duke, so, I knew who Dr. Franklin was, but the crowd that gathered, and that just, and then I think for those of you who knew Dr. Franklin, that sense of sort of, urbane, sort of, he had this kind of urbane, kind of, worldly sort of demeanor, and he was just glad handing everyone. That was just very typical of the way that he interacted with everyone. So yeah, no, it was an overflow crowd. It was the first Wednesdays at the Center of that year. And I think we often tried to do that back then, to kind of have him, at the sort of beginning of the year to kind of launch the year. So yeah, no, it was just, and it was an amazing event, and he held court, and it was just, really lovely. And I just want to thank you guys for having this great idea of doing a series that's based on these talks that we have back in, I think, like, back in the day on iTunes U or whatever it was. So
exactly, yeah. The quality of the clip is, of course, is one of the first event. Actually, it's the first event that was posted by the John Hope Franklin Center on the Wednesdays at the Center event. It's the first historical clip we have. The quality is not good. It's less than 360 pixels. Is still there in iTunes U for all of you to watch it, to revisit it. We tried to do our best to improve the quality of the clip and add something. We invited also Kathy Davidson to to comment on it, but she is teaching right now in New York. She has a very popular graduate class on media and technology that is a seminar on Wednesdays, 3 hours, and she's teaching. We'll try to have her later too. I mean, yes, this event was about Mirror to America, the autobiography of John Hope Franklin that was published in 2005. And in this particular talk, that was very short, very sharp talk, he actually doesn't, as Pedro was referring, doesn't really go into the book, into Mirror to America, as the autobiography, but he goes beyond that, and is something that here at the John Franklin Center and DUSIX, the Duke Center for International and Global Studies, we want to underline is the fact that Dr. Franklin is and was and will be a global scholar, and not only a global scholar, but a global activist for the voices of Black people or people of African descent worldwide. And that not only about people of African descent, but people of indigenous descent, as we were trying to underline too in the first event, because of his multiracial background as a son of a member of the Chickasaw Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma. Then that's something that is very interesting. I think in the short clip, yes, he doesn't talk about racism per se, but he touches on this personal account in this anecdote that he shares when he is sitting in one of the cafes in Istanbul, in Turkey, and he sees that a scene in which someone treats badly a servant, a person who is serving, and how the person reacts. That's directly connected to the way he looks and stands for issues of discrimination. He goes beyond to say they happen everywhere, and they happen many times by subjects of this nation that he considers still a great nation, being very critical of it. We have more commentators. I don't know if Ranji wants to say hi. We will have Ranji doing a short introduction for the event of September 23rd, in which Srinivas and Dr. Franklin are present. Will be great to hear from you. If you want to.
Thanks very much for inviting me to just say something. It's such a great idea to have these recordings presented again, and I have also lovely and strong memories of John Hope Franklin and his the way in which he would speak with such forthrightness, but also it seems like a contradiction in terms almost, but so he was both reserved and very forthright in the way in which he stated his positions, and I always felt that he was an extremely a warm presence as well. Pedro, I came in just as Pedro was speaking about his understanding of the relationship between the local and the national and the international, and that one can't really think one adequately without reference to the others, and that I think has been really important for the work that the Humanities Institute has done, with the work that has been done in trying to understand John Hope Franklin's work as well. One of the talks that he gave that was most memorable to me, it was actually a conversation that he had with the Indian historian Romila Thapar, I'm not sure what year that was. I think maybe it was 2007, 2008. I think that's right. And they were old friends. They had been in residence together at the Library of Congress. But one of the things that they talked about most interestingly was the ways in which historians have been struggling with the states in the Indian context, but also in the US, on textbooks and the restrictions on intellectual work that were basically put in place by governments. So, oh, that's great. We've got the Chris has put the link up in the chat to that conversation. Yeah. So, so that was one of the most memorable events with him.
Trade and environmental
Being
justice.
struck the term of one.
Of the Alien and Sedition Act.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.